The Crito is an early dialogue of Plato, and the context for the book, the Crito, is that Socrates now has been sentenced to death as recorded in the Apology, and he's basically on what we would call death row, where there are a few days before he will be executed. So he's in prison and able to accept visitors. And Crito offers to bribe the officials in order to assist Socrates in escaping. He has a plan so that Socrates can flee safely and get to Thessaly, and Crito has the financial means to do so. Now, Socrates' initial broad response to Crito is that, look, your zeal, your enthusiasm is valuable if you are right? But if you're wrong, then zeal is dangerous. And that's a broad principle then that Socrates affirms. Enthusiasm can be a great thing if it's in the right direction, but it can be very dangerous when aimed at the wrong goal. And Socrates wonders whether his previous arguments have failed or have they changed. His arguments earlier about, for example, to live an unexamined life would be not worth living, that it would be better to go on and do philosophy and suffer the consequences from doing so, these strong statements that he made during the trial. And so he says that he has to be consistent with what reason dictates. He says he's lived his entire life by whatever the best arguments are, whatever the best reasons are. And so there is no way he's going to stop doing that now at the end of his life. So Crito has to convince Socrates to flee if Socrates is going to do that. And he has a few different arguments. The first argument for fleeing is a kind of a self-pity argument. Crito's reputation is going to be damaged. So it's known to all of Athenian culture that Crito has many resources. He's a wealthy person, and it would be known that somebody of that wealth would have the means to arrange for an escape. These things were not that uncommon. And so if Socrates doesn't flee, Crito's own reputation is going to be damaged. He must have loved money more than his friend. And Crito adds that, look, many people are, the many, right, the majority are able to do great evil. Just look at the fact that Socrates has been sentenced to death by the majority of people. And so he pleads with Socrates to flee, and for his own sake and for the sake of the friendship that he has with Socrates. Now, regarding this idea that the many are able to do great evils, Socrates says, look, it's the counsel of the one person who is right that is more important than the incorrect counsel of the many. He says it doesn't matter what the many think, they can be wrong. It's the wise person, the one person who has good counsel that you need to listen to. And so even though on the one hand, yes, the many sentenced Socrates to death, on the other hand, is it wise to flee, right? That's the question. And so far, the fact of his broad reputation being damaged, that's not convincing because it doesn't really matter what the many people think. So Crito has a second argument for fleeing. He says he and the others will lose a friend if Socrates doesn't flee. And so he's saying to Socrates, look, you're just being selfish, sticking with your principles when we're going to be left behind without you. We won't have you here, and we'll lose a friend. So our lives will be diminished by your selfish decision here. And Socrates' response is, look, it's a good life that's to be valued more than life itself. He said that at the trial. He reaffirms it here. And he says, I'm not going to be a good friend if I'm not living a good life. So what has to be considered is whether it's right to escape and flee. And since he's already committed to doing what wisdom dictates, what reason dictates, he says, so far, reason has said that he needs to stay and not flee. So this concept of being a friend, losing a friend, is not convincing, because he wouldn't be just if he stayed, if he rather continued living and flee. But he goes on, and he has a further response to this argument about losing a friend. He imagines this situation. So he personifies the laws of Athens, and he imagines the laws interrogating him in this situation. And he says they would say things like this: look, we brought you into existence by providing the means for your parents to marry. Marriage is a state function, and so Socrates' birth itself is due to the laws that existed. We regulated your education, and so there's this unequal relationship between Socrates and the laws. The laws have the authority. We provided you with common goods. In today's context, that would be roads and public education, those kinds of things. We allowed you to leave if you chose. So just like here in the United States today, in Athens, you could leave if you want to, right? But he chose to stay. In fact, Socrates, with the exception of some military responsibilities, lived his entire life in Athens. Unlike some of the pre-Socratics, he did not travel around. And by doing so, Socrates says this is implied consent. He doesn't use that phrase, but the idea is if you choose to stay there when you could leave, that means you are consenting to the laws of the state. So the bottom line, to summarize the law's position to Socrates, is that you owe your life to us. So Socrates says, how can I violate the laws? The laws have made this case that I have no right to disobey them, and so I should not flee. I have good reasons not to flee. So Crito has a third argument. This is the final argument that he suggests for fleeing. And that is an appeal to his children. So Crito says, you will be deserting your children if you die, right? They will be left without the father. You had these children, you need to follow through and make sure that they are educated properly. Now, it's not stated how old his children are, but recall Socrates is about 80 years old. And so from this context, it appears that he has young children at the time. In any case, his response is that there is a trilemma of sorts regarding his children. So there are three possible things that might occur. First, he could flee. Now, if he flees and he needs to be responsible for his children so that he takes his children, well, he'll be depriving them of an Athenian education, and that would be harmful to them. Socrates thinks that the Athenian education is of great value. And then, so the alternative would be, well, he could flee, but not take his children. But if Socrates leaves without his children, surely his friends would take care of them and their education. His friends would see to it that they received a fine Athenian education. But if he doesn't leave and he dies, of course, in that case, his friends are going to take the responsibility of caring for his children and their education. And so we see that the results of B and C is that his friends are going to take care of his children. So there's no difference if he stays and submits to the death penalty and fleeing without his children. Either way, his friends are going to take care of their education. And it would be harmful to them if he flees and takes his children. So leaving with his children would harm them. Leaving without his children is no different than dying. And this case that Crito is trying to make, that there's this problem about deserting his children, we see that it's meritless, that this argument also fails. So, as a summary of Socrates' position here, as he sits on death row, if he flees, he's going to do evil. He would be committed an injustice against the laws, and in fact, he would be guilty of undermining the laws by people seeing this, by the youth that loved him so much would see that he was fleeing, and that would actually make himself guilty of corrupting the youth. If he stays, he avoids the greater evil of becoming unjust himself. And that's what is most important. So recall the fourth Socratic doctrine, the idea that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice. Socrates has been committed to that through his life, and so now he is continued to be committed to that in his death. Now, there are the metaphysical assumptions about Socrates. He has this idea of the potential for life after death. He also has this view of the soul, right, that can outlive the body, as described in the Phaedo. And so there's this significant difference between the soul and the body. So he reiterates that toward the end of the dialogue. And it's much more important to care for one's soul and to do what's right than to, when you have to make a decision between doing something that's good for the soul or the body, but you cannot do both. You have to go with the soul, even if that means the body is going to be put to death. And he stays by that position right up to the point of the execution.